Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on a story that should alarm every single American, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum.
We're talking about the wall between intelligence agencies and law enforcement. That wall exists for a reason. It was built to protect you, to protect me, to protect every person living in this country from the full surveillance power of the state being turned inward. Tonight, we have reporting that the Trump administration is actively working to tear that wall down.
This isn't hypothetical. This isn't speculation. This is happening right now, through executive action and bureaucratic maneuvering, and if you're not paying attention, you could wake up in a country where the CIA has access to your local police records and the FBI's files are an open book for intelligence analysts who were never supposed to be looking at domestic data.
So stay with us. This is going to be a detailed, sourced, fact-driven investigation into what's changing, who's driving it, and what it means for the future of privacy in America. Let's get into it.
Our lead story tonight comes from investigative reporting by ProPublica, one of the most rigorous non-profit newsrooms in the country. They've uncovered that the Trump administration is moving to give intelligence agencies, including the CIA, significantly easier access to law enforcement files. We're talking about records held by agencies like the FBI, the DEA, and other federal law enforcement bodies.
Let's be precise about what this means, because the details matter enormously. Under long-standing rules and norms, there has been a deliberate separation between intelligence collection, which is focused outward on foreign threats, and law enforcement, which is focused inward on domestic crime. That separation isn't just bureaucratic tidiness. It's a constitutional principle rooted in the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizure.
Exactly right. And what ProPublica's reporting reveals is that the administration is pursuing changes that would allow intelligence community agencies to query and access law enforcement databases with far fewer restrictions than currently exist. This includes databases containing information on American citizens, on people who have never been charged with a crime, on people who are simply mentioned in investigative files.
Now, to understand why this is so significant, you need to understand what's actually in law enforcement files. We're not just talking about arrest records and conviction data. Federal law enforcement databases contain interview notes, surveillance records, tips from informants, financial transaction reports, travel records, communications metadata, and in many cases, the raw personal information of witnesses, associates, family members, and bystanders who were never the target of any investigation.
That's the critical point. These databases are vast, and they sweep in enormous amounts of information about people who are not suspected of anything. When the FBI investigates a case, the file doesn't just contain information about the suspect. It contains information about everyone the suspect talked to, everyone who lives at a particular address, everyone who made a phone call to a particular number. The collateral data collection is massive.
And until now, intelligence agencies have faced significant procedural hurdles to accessing that domestic law enforcement data. Those hurdles exist because of painful historical lessons. We learned, through the Church Committee investigations in the 1970s, what happens when you let intelligence agencies operate domestically without restrictions. The CIA spied on American anti-war protesters. The NSA intercepted the communications of civil rights leaders. The FBI ran CNTLPRO, which targeted Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panthers, and countless other Americans exercising their constitutional rights.
The Church Committee's findings were so disturbing that they led directly to the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, and to executive orders that specifically restricted intelligence agencies from domestic surveillance activities. Executive Order 12333, signed by Ronald Reagan in 1981, has been the foundational document governing the intelligence community's relationship with domestic information for over 4 decades. It explicitly limits what intelligence agencies can do with information about U.S. persons.
So when we talk about the Trump administration lowering barriers between intelligence and law enforcement databases, we're talking about undermining protections that were put in place because the government already abused this exact power once before. This isn't theoretical risk. This is documented historical reality.
And here's where ProPublica's reporting gets into the mechanics of how this is being accomplished. This isn't happening through new legislation that would require congressional debate and public scrutiny. It's happening through executive action, through changes to internal policies and interagency agreements. The administration is using its executive authority to reinterpret or modify the rules governing information sharing, effectively bypassing Congress entirely.
That procedural point is crucial. When you change the law, there are hearings. There is public comment. There is debate. There is a record. When you change executive policy, you can do it quietly. You can do it with a memo. You can do it with a phone call between agency heads. And that's exactly the kind of opacity we're seeing here. The public has limited visibility into exactly what access is being granted, to whom, under what conditions, and with what oversight.
Let's talk about who benefits from this arrangement, because that question always reveals the real motivation. Intelligence agencies have wanted broader access to domestic data for years. After September 11th, the mantra became connect the dots and break down the silos. And there were legitimate arguments for better information sharing in specific counterterrorism contexts. But what we've seen, repeatedly, is that authorities granted for narrow purposes get expanded far beyond their original intent.
The classic example is Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which was sold to the public as a targeted tool for tracking specific terrorist suspects and was eventually used to justify the bulk collection of every American's phone records, as Edward Snowden revealed in 2013. The pattern is always the same. A power is created for a narrow, sympathetic purpose, and then it metastasizes.
And in this case, the sympathetic purpose is national security. Nobody wants to be the person who argues against catching terrorists. But the question isn't whether we want to catch terrorists. The question is whether we want to build a surveillance infrastructure that gives intelligence agencies routine access to the domestic records of 330 million Americans in order to do it.
Because that's the endgame here. Once you remove the procedural barriers between intelligence and law enforcement databases, you've created a de facto domestic surveillance system. The CIA doesn't need to spy on Americans directly if it can simply query FBI databases that already contain Americans' information. The NSA doesn't need to intercept your communications if it can access DEA records that already contain your financial transactions and travel patterns.
And this brings us to a fundamental question about power and its abuse. The administration's argument, to the extent it's been made publicly, is that this is about efficiency. It's about making sure the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. It's about protecting the country. But efficiency in surveillance is not a neutral value. An efficient surveillance state is still a surveillance state.
Let's look at the broader context in which this is happening. This move is not occurring in isolation. The Trump administration has simultaneously been expanding the use of immigration enforcement databases, pushing for greater access to financial transaction records, and working to weaken encryption protections that shield private communications. Each of these moves, taken individually, might seem like a reasonable security measure. Taken together, they represent a systematic expansion of government surveillance capacity.
And we should note the political context as well. This is an administration that has openly discussed using government agencies against political opponents. The president has publicly called for investigations into his critics, into journalists, into political rivals. When you combine that rhetoric with an actual expansion of surveillance tools, the implications are chilling. You're not just building a system that could be abused. You're building it in an environment where abuse has been explicitly threatened.
I want to be clear about something. This is not a partisan point. The surveillance state has expanded under administrations of both parties. Barack Obama's administration dramatically expanded drone surveillance and prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous administrations combined. George W. Bush's administration created the warrantless wiretapping program. The bipartisan consensus in Washington has consistently favored more surveillance, not less.
That's an important point, Alex. But what distinguishes this moment is the combination of expanded capability with openly authoritarian rhetoric. Previous administrations expanded surveillance while at least paying lip service to civil liberties and oversight. What we're seeing now is an expansion of surveillance power coupled with open contempt for the institutions that are supposed to provide oversight, the courts, the inspectors general, the congressional intelligence committees.
And speaking of oversight, let's talk about what's not in place. ProPublica's reporting highlights that these changes are being made without corresponding increases in oversight mechanisms. When you expand access to data, you need to expand auditing of that access. You need to expand reporting requirements. You need to expand the ability of inspectors general and courts to review how the data is being used. None of that is happening here.
In fact, the opposite is happening. The administration has been actively undermining inspectors general across the federal government, firing or sidelining watchdogs whose job is exactly this kind of oversight. So at the precise moment when intelligence agencies are getting broader access to law enforcement data about Americans, the people whose job it is to make sure that access isn't abused are being removed from their positions.
That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy. You expand the power and you eliminate the oversight simultaneously. And you do both through executive action so that Congress doesn't get a meaningful say. It's a blueprint for building a surveillance apparatus with no accountability.
Let's also discuss the technology dimension, because the nature of surveillance has changed fundamentally since the Church Committee era. In the 1970s, accessing someone's records meant physically going to a file cabinet, pulling out a folder, and reading paper documents. It was slow, it was labor-intensive, and those practical limitations served as a de facto check on abuse. You couldn't surveil everyone because you didn't have the capacity.
Today, databases are digital, searchable, and interconnectable. An analyst sitting at a terminal can run queries across multiple databases simultaneously and pull up a comprehensive profile of any individual in seconds. Artificial intelligence and machine learning tools can process millions of records and identify patterns that no human analyst could find. The practical limitations that once constrained surveillance no longer exist. The only limitations left are legal and policy ones, and those are precisely what's being weakened.
And the data itself is richer than anything the Church Committee could have imagined. Law enforcement databases today don't just contain names and addresses. They contain biometric data, facial recognition profiles, cell phone location histories, social media activity, financial transactions, travel records, and communication patterns. Giving intelligence agencies easier access to this data means giving them a window into the intimate details of Americans' daily lives.
I think it's worth pausing on what this means for ordinary people. There's a tendency to think of surveillance as something that affects other people, suspects, criminals, people who have something to hide. But the reality is that bulk surveillance systems affect everyone. If you've ever been mentioned in a police report, even as a witness. If you've ever had a financial transaction flagged, even incorrectly. If you've ever traveled to a country that intelligence agencies consider interesting. Your information is in these databases. And now it may be accessible to agencies that were never supposed to see it.
And the chilling effect is real and well documented. When people know they're being watched, they change their behavior. They're less likely to attend protests. They're less likely to contact journalists. They're less likely to join organizations that might be seen as controversial. They're less likely to exercise the rights that are supposed to be protected by the First Amendment. Surveillance doesn't just catch wrongdoers. It suppresses dissent.
There's academic research backing this up. Studies published after the Snowden revelations showed measurable declines in internet searches for terms associated with government surveillance, in Wikipedia traffic to articles about terrorism and civil liberties, and in the willingness of sources to talk to journalists. The mere knowledge that surveillance exists changes behavior at a population level. That's not security. That's social control.
Now, let's connect this to the broader pattern we've been tracking on this show. This move to give intelligence agencies access to law enforcement files doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of a larger architecture of information control. We've seen the expansion of fusion centers, which blend federal, state, and local law enforcement data with intelligence information. We've seen the growth of the suspicious activity reporting system, where everyday behaviors can be flagged and entered into federal databases. We've seen the proliferation of automated license plate readers, facial recognition systems, and cell site simulators, all feeding data into systems that are becoming increasingly interconnected.
Each one of those programs was introduced with its own narrow justification. License plate readers help find stolen cars. Facial recognition helps identify suspects. Fusion centers help coordinate emergency response. But when you connect them all together and then give intelligence agencies the keys, you've built something that looks less like a collection of individual tools and more like the comprehensive surveillance infrastructure of an authoritarian state.
And here's what keeps me up at night, Alex. These systems are being built now, under this administration, with this rhetoric. But they will persist across administrations. The surveillance apparatus being constructed today will be inherited by every future president. And once these capabilities exist, they are almost never rolled back. The ratchet only turns one direction.
That's the lesson of history. The NSA's bulk collection program, once revealed, was supposedly reformed by the USA Freedom Act. But the underlying capabilities remained. The Patriot Act's most controversial provisions have been reauthorized again and again, with minimal modification. The FISA court, which was supposed to provide judicial oversight of intelligence surveillance, has approved more than 99% of all government requests. Once you build the machine keeps running.
So what should people do with this information? Because I know our audience doesn't just want to be informed. They want to act. First, contact your representatives. This is being done through executive action specifically because the administration doesn't want congressional input. Demand that Congress assert its oversight authority. Demand hearings. Demand transparency about what access is being granted and what safeguards exist.
Second, support the organizations that are fighting this. The ACLU, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, ProPublica itself, these organizations are doing the work of uncovering and challenging surveillance overreach. They need funding and they need public support. Third, take your own digital security seriously. Use encrypted communications. Be aware of what information you're sharing and with whom. Not because you have anything to hide, but because privacy is a right, and rights that aren't exercised are rights that get taken away.
And finally, pay attention. The greatest ally of surveillance expansion is public indifference. These changes are being made quietly, through bureaucratic channels, precisely because the people making them know that public attention is their enemy. The best thing you can do is stay informed and make sure the people around you are informed too.
Let's bring this full circle. What we're looking at tonight is not just a policy change. It's a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and the governed. The separation between intelligence and law enforcement was built on a principle, that the awesome power of state surveillance should never be turned against the domestic population without extraordinary justification and rigorous oversight. That principle is being eroded, deliberately, systematically, and quietly.
And the timing matters. We are living in a moment of extraordinary political polarization, where government officials have openly discussed using state power against political opponents. Building a more powerful, less accountable surveillance apparatus in this environment isn't just careless. It's dangerous. The question isn't whether this power will be abused. The question is when, and against whom.
ProPublica's reporting on this should be a 5-alarm fire for anyone who cares about civil liberties, democratic governance, or the basic right to live your life without the government looking over your shoulder. The fact that it isn't dominating every front page in the country tells you something about how normalized surveillance has become. We've been boiled so slowly that we barely notice the temperature rising.
And that normalization is itself a strategy. Every time the boundary gets pushed a little further and nothing happens, the new boundary becomes the baseline. What was unthinkable 10 years ago is routine today. What's controversial today will be unremarkable tomorrow. Unless we push back. Unless we insist that some lines are not supposed to be crossed.
History is going to judge this era, and it's going to judge it based on what we did when we saw the warning signs. The Church Committee acted because the abuses of the intelligence community became too egregious to ignore. We have the advantage of knowing that history. We know what happens when intelligence agencies get unchecked access to domestic information. The question is whether we're going to let it happen again.
The information is out there. ProPublica has done the investigative work. The historical record is clear. The pattern is visible to anyone willing to look. What's missing isn't knowledge. What's missing is the collective will to say, this is a line we will not allow to be crossed.
And that brings us to the close of tonight's show. What we've covered tonight isn't just another policy story. It's a story about the architecture of power in America, who has it, how it's being expanded, and what safeguards are being dismantled to make sure nobody can check it.
We bring you these stories because an informed public is the only real check on unchecked power. Transparency is the disinfectant. Attention is the accountability mechanism. And your engagement, your refusal to look away, is what makes this journalism matter.
Share this episode. Talk about it. Ask your representatives hard questions. And come back next time, because we'll be here, doing the work, following the money, and exposing what powerful people want kept in the dark. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. And never stop asking who benefits when your rights get a little smaller. Good night.